Welcome back. This is the presentation that's really going to get us to the verge of the Civil War. I've called this slavery, sectionalism, and politics, the road to the Civil War. Or we could even shorthand this and just call it the 1850s. This is going to be the presentation where we really detail several occasions where North and South are going to be divided over the issue of slavery. It is going to create more sectionalism, and politically, the nation's going to be divided heading throughout the 1850s. So, um, this will kind of pick up where we left off with the Mexican American War and the land obtained there, and will take us through the decade of the 1850s all the way up to the 1860 election and the beginning of states seceding from the Union. So here we go. To start off with, we left off last time with um, the acquisition of all of this new land from Mexico. It would include California, New Mexico territory. You can see that includes more than just the state of New Mexico now. And even this map shows Utah territory, which is more than just the state of Utah as well. And something I skipped in the earlier presentation was the Wilmot Proviso. Well, David Wilmot was a Northern Democrat, and in the early stages of the Mexican American War, Wilmot had this idea. When Congress was voting on some money that would be used to fight the war, Wilmot tried to add this little amendment, this proviso, to um, that bill for appropriating $2 million for fighting the war. Wilmot said, let's make it a rule. Any territory acquired from Mexico cannot be land that slavery spreads into. Now, first of all, we can see he was already anticipating if we go to war with Mexico, we're going to win and we're going to end up with some more territory. As a Democrat, he was wanting to see territorial spread. He wants to see manifest destiny played out. But as a Northerner, he did not want these territories to be slave territories, places where slavery could spread to. So he attempted to add this to a bill that was going to be raising money for the war, the Wilmot Proviso. Well, it doesn't pass. In fact, it creates quite a stir, quite a division among politicians, because some people are wondering, while we're talking about fighting Mexico, why are you bringing slavery into this? Those are completely separate issues. But his failed proviso here does become the basis of a new party, the Free Soil Party. Now, here we're also going to see the beginning of some political parties falling apart. The Free Soilers are going to draw from some people who were disgruntled either with the Whig Party, most likely. There could be some Democrats that would join as well, Northern Democrats. But basically, the Free Soil Party is going to say slavery should not spread into this land obtained from Mexico. Now, free soilers are not the same as abolitionists. They're not saying slavery must end everywhere. They're not talking about slavery where it already exists. But they were insisting this territory should be free soil with free laborers, no slavery. In fact, David Wilmot and a lot of free soilers, they don't want free blacks coming into California. They want it to be territory for only free white laborers. They don't want to compete against slave labor, and they really aren't for total racial equality. But they don't want to see the spread of slavery. Hold on to that idea. That is significant. Now, they're not going to win the 1848 election. They'll have some local congressmen, but they're not going to win the presidential election. But they're certainly going to do better than previous anti-slavery um, groups in politics. because they're not as extreme. They're not pushing for an end to slavery everywhere. They're just wanting to stop the spread of slavery in the West. That is going to be a very divisive issue. Well, California has enough people to become a state very quickly, thanks to a gold rush, the discovery of gold in 1848, and then a larger rush the following year, the 49ers. California is ready to jump to statehood rather quickly. And there's a lot of other issues out in the West that Congress will have to decide on for the future of the United States. Now, to me, this is a really climactic moment because we have three of the greatest congressmen and senators in U.S. history who have had long battles with one another since the War of 1812. They're still around, older men now, but this compromise of 1850 will still have Henry Clay from Kentucky, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts still arguing their points, their regions of the country. Well, Henry Clay is going to take the lead here in pushing these compromise bills. He was hoping it could all get passed in one great big bill, but in fact, that fails. It's going to end up being broken into all of its separate little parts and passed one by one. So, in some ways, this term compromise of 1850 is a little misleading. It makes us think that perhaps North and South agreed on these principles, they came to some middle ground, and they compromised to pass all of these details I'm going to share. When in fact, it wasn't much of a compromise at all. There was enough votes, from different constituencies on each individual piece that they all get passed. But it's not really that most Northerners and Southerners had compromised their stance on slavery or anything else. Now, it's really not going to be Henry Clay that finally gets these passed through, but it's a younger senator named Stephen Douglas that we'll talk about. But I want you to focus on just a few of the specifics of this compromise of 1850. First of all, one part was that California would become a free state. That seemed like it was likely to happen anyway. This had been Mexican territory and Mexico prohibited slavery. But there were still a lot of Southerners that insisted California should be open to slavery. Certainly the southern half should. If we just take this Missouri Compromise line and continue it out, well, then the southern part of California should theoretically still be open to slavery. But the bill coming out of this compromise of 1850 will say California enters as a free state. This is a victory for northern states, groups who are anti slavery. But then the next part said another bill would say that New Mexico territory, and really they're including Utah as well. So all of this, we will just allow popular sovereignty to decide the slavery question there. These places were not going to be states yet, but Congress was agreeing that the people in those territories would vote on whether or not they allow slavery or not. So they were letting the people be sovereign. Popular sovereignty would decide the slavery question there. Now, this this was quite controversial. There were a lot of people from the North who pointed out, rightly so, that even though we've got this Missouri Compromise line dividing right here, so maybe this should fall under slave territory. Have you ever driven through New Mexico and Arizona? If you've seen this territory geographically, you'll know it's very different than this area. As you drive, especially as you get to the eastern part of Texas, not my part, not West Texas, but once you pass Dallas and get quite a bit further east, there's trees everywhere. It's green, and it's green in all of the southeast. Lots of rainfall, lots of tall trees. Where they've cleared land, they get really tall cotton as well. Where I grew up, there were cotton farms, cotton um, everywhere, but it doesn't grow up so tall. It just, covers miles and miles of acreage, so you still get a lot of it. Well, New Mexico and Arizona, there's a lot of desert there. Some people thought God has already prohibited this from really being slave cotton culture because that's not the kind of geography they have. But there are still Southerners like John C. Calhoun that insist a person should be able to take their slave wherever they move. And especially if a place is not a state yet. If they have not, a state, if they want to make a law that says they're not going to allow slavery, fine. But when something is still a territory, when it is national domain, it belongs to the whole United States. And Southerners should be able to take their property there just as much as Northern people. So this whole compromise of letting the people decide there, this is a victory for the Southern states. At least it makes it potential that slavery will be allowed in these territories, regardless of what their geography is like. Well, another part of the compromise had to do with slavery or the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. is right there between two slave states. It's bordered on the south by Virginia and the north with Maryland, two slave states. So slavery was legal in the nation's capital. And in fact, there were slave auctions in the nation's capital. This was a source of embarrassment to people who are anti slavery. That Great Britain has outlawed slavery, France has outlawed slavery, but the United States still keeps it going. And in fact, the nation's capital has people sold on the auction block. It's an embarrassment to anti slavery folks. So, one part of the compromise says we'll end the slave trade in DC. There still will be people sold in South Carolina and other parts of Virginia, Maryland, does not end DC. Now, slavery was still legal there, and it would remain legal there unless both Virginia and Maryland consented to end slavery. But the slave trade itself would end. This is a victory for the northern anti-slavery folks. But here came the most significant part of this compromise of 1850, a fugitive slave law. A lot of Southerners have been complaining for years that their runaway slaves may go into northern states, and those states don't do anything to try to apprehend these fugitives. So, someone from Kentucky, slaves just cross the Ohio River, they come into Ohio or Indiana, Illinois. There may not be anyone that really helps apprehend those fugitives and return them to their owner. Well, the new fugitive slave law said um, that it says that Southerners, have a right to go and seek out their property, and that those northern states really should be helping apprehend them as well. You cannot give aid and comfort to a runaway. You're supposed to help apprehend them and get them back to their owner. Well, this is going to upset a lot of people in the North, even people who were pretty indifferent about Southern slavery. They don't really like this law that says you're supposed to help them reacquire their slaves. You cannot help their slaves escape. You cannot put them in your home and help them run away. This is going to upset northern states quite a bit. But the fugitive slave law, that's something Southerners insisted on. There had been earlier versions of this, they've just been ignored. And in fact, a lot of northern states have made it very plain we will not follow national law on this. So, northern states have some states' rights issues as well, things where they feel we're not following the national law and we're right in doing so. Well, This is 1850. These are some parts of the compromise that are supposed to keep the country happily together. But of course, the decade is going to be filled with one divisive thing after another. That's what we're going to look at here. One of the issues, the fugitive slave law, really, was the inspiration behind this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe, of course, we've mentioned her father, Lyman Beecher. Um, Stowe was doing what women could do in making addressing public issues. She wasn't going to go and be a speaker. She didn't think that was really appropriate for women. She wasn't going to get address political subjects, but she could write. She could make up stories and write a novel. And that's what she does with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, there's a couple of storylines in the book, little spoiler alerts here. Um, Part of it is about a woman trying to run away with her child, a slave woman who's trying to escape across the Ohio River. But of course, when she does make this dramatic escape, she's really still not going to be safe because of the fugitive slave law. There's people in Ohio that are supposed to apprehend her now. And, if she made it all the way to Minnesota, there would still be people that are supposed to apprehend her. She may not be safe unless she can get all the way to Canada. That's one part of the story. But the title character, Uncle Tom, is described as this mountain of a man, a huge, strong man, but with a very gentle spirit. He is just a member of the family. And Harriet Beecher Stowe intentionally tries to show that there can be kind, Christian, well meaning slave owners. But of course, she's going to show that, but the system is what's wrong. That even these kind, Christian like families, when they have hard times, those slaves really aren't members of the family. Those slaves can still be sold to someone else who won't be so kind. And that's what happens to Uncle Tom. He's going to be, he's going to be like a member of the family, but he will get sold a couple of times deeper and deeper into the South, and eventually with a man who is cruel and vindictive, a man that just likes to punish other human beings to assert his authority over them. And eventually, he's going to beat Uncle Tom to death. Now, the term Uncle Tom now among African Americans is not a flattering term. Someone's called an Uncle Tom, it sounds more like you give in to the abuse. You just accept racism and you don't do anything to fight for your own people. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe wasn't trying to create a weakling character. She thought she was creating a Christ-like character, a man who certainly could stop the beating if he wanted to. If he wanted to just take the whip out of this vindictive owner's hands, he could probably kill him hand-to-hand combat. But Uncle Tom is not like that. He turns the other cheek. He submits to the abuse, and he eventually is killed for it. He loses the physical battle, but he is, spiritually much the superior. So this story, this novel, is a huge hit in the North. This is like the Harry Potter of books of this time. This sells so quickly, and people in the North read this and they feel like, yes, she is capturing what slavery is really like and what's really wrong with it. There may be some good meaning people, but this is what's wrong with it. Slavery can divide families. Um, Slavery treats human beings like cattle, like, something that is owned, a commodity. The people in the South hate this book. They think it is a gross misrepresentation of slavery. It is a manipulative book that's going to rip your heart out for the slaves and make you despise some of these Southern slave owners. So the nation is very divided over this very popular novel. Uncle Tom's Cabin does more than anything else to get a lot of people in the North upset about slavery and determined to see it come to an end. Well, in the middle of the decade, 1854, we have another divisive issue. And for this, I need to go back to a map. The Kansas Nebraska Act, passed in 1854, has to do with these territories. Kansas, which is more than just the state of, you can see this includes quite a bit more territory, and Nebraska, which is more than just the state of Nebraska. This goes up into the Dakotas. This is land that had been part of the Louisiana Purchase, but had not become states yet. Well, Stephen Douglas, that was instrumental in that compromise of 1850, Stephen Douglas has this idea that if popular sovereignty was good enough to settle the slavery question here in lands obtained from Mexico, why don't we apply that to part of the Louisiana Purchase? Why not let just the people of Kansas and Nebraska decide whether or not they will be slave states in the future? Well, the problem was a generation earlier, the Missouri Compromise line had already settled that question. When Missouri became a slave state, here was a line dividing the future slave and free territories. So here Kansas and Nebraska sit above this line. That means these are supposed to be free territories. Now Stephen Douglas has said, let's don't just let a line determine that. Let the people vote on it. Let them decide if they'll be slave or free territories. Well, what that's going to lead to is fighting in Kansas. People will move to Kansas from all the way in New England. There'll be a bunch of people that will move across the country to make sure they're there in Kansas to vote for a free state. And there'll be some that just cross over the border from Missouri, just cross over and make sure they're there to make Kansas a slave state. Kansas becomes a battleground even before there's a civil war nationwide. There's a civil war in Kansas. At one point, there's a group of the pro-slavery people who draft their own constitution, and a group of the anti-slavery people, they draft their own constitution. One will say, "Look here, Kansas has agreed to be a free state." The other will say, "I don't know what they're talking about. We've voted, we've agreed to become a slave state." And there's fighting between these two sides. One of the most notorious parts of the fight, there's a man named John Brown who comes from the north, and he comes into Kansas with his sons, his grown adult sons. And after there had been an attack on the town of Lawrence, Kansas, that was kind of the anti-slavery town. John Brown and his sons take it upon themselves to go and get vengeance. They go and break into the homes of several pro-slavery folks, and they just drag the men out and hack them to death with machetes. They make sure, if we've heard 5 people were killed in Lawrence, we're going to kill 5 of them. We'll come back to John Brown in a little bit, but there's problems mid 1850s already over the status of Kansas. Is it going to be a slave state or free state? And they're already fighting over it. Well, this picture here on this slide depicts a fight between 2 senators, Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner. Now, Charles Sumner is the one on the ground there, but Sumner was one of the most anti-slavery senators in the 1850s. Preston Brooks is a senator from South Carolina. And Sumner had said some very unflattering things about some of Brooks's kinfolks. Basically, he had said that these slaveholders, are so in love with slavery. They're so insistent that slavery spread. It's like a mistress to them. It is like another wife. They cheat on their real wives with this mistress of slavery. It's kind of a childish sort of thing. If you love it so much, why don't you marry it? You ever use that one on the playground? It's embarrassing, really, to look back at. But Sumner had said things that were offensive to slave owners, and particularly to Preston Brooks's cousin, his kinfolk. Well, Brooks wanted to come and confirm that that is, in fact, what was said. So he approaches Senator Sumner and says, "Did you really say these things about my family?" And Sumner doesn't deny it. Yes, he did say these things. And Brooks takes out his metal tipped cane and starts hitting Sumner in the head with it. He beats him there at his desk, and Sumner, tries to defend himself, but he's completely taken by surprise. He was ready for, maybe a verbal lashing, an argument, but he was not prepared to get hit upside the head with this cane. And Brooks continues to wail upon him. Now, um, they're finally broken up, but what's interesting is the different reactions North and South will have about this incident. People in the North, particularly in Charles Sumner's state of Massachusetts, they will see this as an example of the vicious, violent nature of Southern slaveholders. They're just so used to beating their slaves to get their way that they don't know how to verbally argue. They just hit people. It's always violence. And Sumner, he was seriously hurt from this, but even when he might have been well, he might have been good, strong enough to go back to the Senate. He won't go back, and Massachusetts doesn't elect a new senator. They just leave that seat vacant. They think that vacant seat is going to speak volumes. It's going to constantly remind people, remember what these Southern slaveholders are like. Remember what happened to Sumner. Well, you can probably tell from the picture here, the political cartoon, that this is a very pro Sumner kind of argument. I mean, a pro Sumner kind of artwork. Sumner is a handsome man here, just laying on the ground. He's really just defending himself with the pen. The pen's supposed to be mightier than the sword, but for a Southerner, this guy, we don't even see his face, but Preston Brooks has wild hair and probably a wild look in his eye. And he's got friends in the background that are just laughing and egging him on. Um, but for Southerners, especially people from South Carolina, they're not all that embarrassed of Preston Brooks. There's still a culture of fighting duels in the South. And, Brooks would say, if Sumner had been a gentleman, you would have challenged him to a duel. But when someone's not a gentleman, you just beat them like you do a dog or something else to bring them back into line. Brooks um, offers to resign his seat here, but the people will immediately elect him back to that position. He's not going to lose all popularity back home. In fact, he starts to receive a lot of packages in the mail. He starts to receive new canes, that have messages like "hit him again," "be ready next time." So the nation is dividing further and further, and we can see that even in some of the confrontations between senators. The following year, 1857, and by the way, you're not having to remember all these dates. I'm trying to just create the impression that the 1850s is filled with these divisive issues. 1857, it's a Supreme Court case. And of course, it takes many years for something to get to the Supreme Court. So this has been going on through the 1850s already. The case involves a slave named Dred Scott, who had lived in Northern Territory. He had lived up in Minnesota for a while and back to Missouri. And after his owner had died, Dred Scott decided to take his case to court and sue for his freedom. He believed, because I've lived in Northern Territory, I've lived these other places, why should I not be a free man now? Well, some courts would say that he should be, but there'll be appeals, and this will finally go all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has a very interesting ruling, very controversial, interesting ruling about Dred Scott's case. This is not going to be John Marshall's Supreme Court. He can't be Chief Justice forever, and he died in the 1830s. Now, this is a very democratically dominated Supreme Court, led by a man named Roger Taney, an Andrew Jackson appointee. Roger Taney says Dred Scott thinks that he should be free because he's lived in Northern Territory, but in fact, the Missouri Compromise, let me get back to that map again. This Missouri Compromise line that was supposed to determine what is free territory, what could be slave territory, that Missouri Compromise was always unconstitutional. Congress had no authority to just draw a line and say, slavery cannot exist above this line. The court was saying that Missouri Compromise line is null and void, much like the Kansas-Nebraska Act had already said that. Kansas was obviously above that line, but now Kansas-Nebraska Act was saying we're going to let people vote for whether or not slavery will exist here. The court reaffirms the Missouri Compromise was always unconstitutional. But furthermore, Roger Taney will go on to say, Dred Scott has no right to bring this case to court because as a slave, he is not a citizen of the United States. He does not have the same kind of rights and privileges that American citizens would have. American citizens can bring cases to court, but a slave cannot. A slave cannot bring a case to court any more than a horse or a mule, cattle can. And he doesn't say that Dred Scott is inhuman, but he does make a distinction here and say slaves are not citizens of the United States. They don't have the same rights as citizens, and they don't have the right to bring this case to court. Well, really, that's all he needed to say, but Taney wants to go ahead and go further and say, oh, by the way, the Missouri Compromise, that was always unconstitutional. So he gets two big political points in here by saying slaves are not citizens and the Missouri Compromise was wrong. It was unconstitutional. Well, um, um, this is a decision that is going to fire people up in the North. They're going to be so mad about this controversial decision. People in the South will cheer. At least we've got the Supreme Court on our side. We may not have the numbers to win in Congress, but the Supreme Court understands. Well, we could just end the decade with one more big controversy. I mentioned John Brown in Kansas. His much more famous fight against slavery happens in Virginia. John Brown, this abolitionist, decides to try to start a slave rebellion in Virginia. No, now a lot of abolitionists were also um, anti-violence. They were completely for winning people over through peace. Not John Brown. He's a man of action. He's ready to fight. So John Brown has this very poorly thought out plan to try to raid the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, give weapons to the slaves, and he believes slaves will come to him in mass numbers and there'll be this giant slave rebellion. And it'll spread beyond Virginia. It'll just keep on growing until slavery is eradicated. Well, like I said, the plan is not very well thought out. So John Brown and his men will be stopped pretty soon into this rebellion, this raid on Harper's Ferry. It's going to be Robert E. Lee and his men that are some of those that apprehend John Brown. What's most important here is what's going to happen as a result of John Brown's raid. What's going to happen to him and how both sides will react. In the North, they depict John Brown in this way. Here he is. He's already received his death sentence and he's on his way to being hanged. And as he's walking out of the courthouse, he's going to stop and kiss a baby, a little slave woman's baby. It's kind of hard to tell in this color, but John Brown is a white man. He's a white man, but he is so gentle in spirit from this picture that he's going to stop and kiss babies on the way to being executed. That's how Northerners saw him, and many of them sing his praises. We already had some theme music, but for this lecture, but we could add another one with John Brown's body lies a smoldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a smoldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a smoldering in the grave, but his soul is marching on. Come on, join me, everyone. Glory, glory. You get the idea. They sang praises of John Brown, and that tune that actually becomes the battle hymn of the Republic was sung in praise of John Brown, his courage, for his love and devotion to trying to free the slaves, his devotion to justice. Now, that's not the way Southerners are going to see John Brown. This is a much more recent painting, but this might illustrate how some Southerners thought of John Brown. He's a wild man. He's a wild man with a wild look in his eye who, may take the Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other and will fight violently to end slavery. Southerners thought, this man only wants to overthrow slaveholders and just put the slaves on top. And if Northerners are singing his praise, that must be what they want too. How can they be praising a man whose plan was to kill us? North and South is very divided, perhaps beyond repair after 1859. Well, let's end with an election. This has been about slavery dividing the country, dividing the parties. And in fact, the parties have kind of come apart in this decade. There's very little national party that can hold the different sections together. There are new parties. You'll read about the Know Nothings or the American Party. This is really a party focused on the problems of immigrants. The Know Nothings are an anti-immigrant party. And it was very popular, in fact. It grew quite a bit. There was concern about large numbers of Irish and German immigrants coming in, especially if they're Catholic immigrants. The Know Nothings think these people are changing our country and we're not happy about it. But this was definitely a Northern party. There's not a lot of Know Nothing support in the South. There's not a lot of immigrants coming into the South. It's a Northern issue. I've already mentioned the Free Soilers. Obviously, that is also a Northern party. There's not going to be a lot of Southern support that says, let's stop the spread of slavery. And there's also a new party called the Republicans. This is not the same as the old Thomas Jefferson Democratic Republicans, or they might just call themselves Republicans. This is a new party from the 1850s, the party that we're still going to be having today, the Republican Party, though it has certainly changed over time. The Republicans were just a Northern party. Um, there's not Southern support for Republicans. The Democrats were still the only party that might claim some Northern and Southern branches that are held together, but in 1860, Democrats are going to fall apart too. So in that election, one of the perhaps the most significant in American history. I know we always hear that every election is supposed to be the most important we've ever had, but this one's the one that actually divided a nation as soon as it was had. The election of 1860 featured Stephen Douglas as a Northern Democrat. Remember, he's the Compromise of 1850 guy. He's the Kansas Nebraska Act guy. And you probably also know him from something called Lincoln Douglas debates. He ran against Abraham Lincoln for the Senate and he won. But in that race, they had a whole series of debates over slavery. So keep in mind, Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, they're both from Illinois. They're both from a state where slavery is illegal. But Douglas thought that popular sovereignty ought to settle this question, the slavery question, around the nation. So Douglas, Northern Democrat, can't get a lot of Southern support, though. Southerners prefer John Breckinridge, who was currently the vice president, or had been the vice president, and they felt much more confident he's going to insist on slavery not being eradicated and spreading to the West. He's even stronger on it. So Democrats are divided. There's even a new party just for this election called the Constitutional Union Party, or we might think of them as the "why can't we just get along" party. Um, John Bell leads a group, and Sam Houston, by the way, would have been another Constitutional Union person, someone who just thought we should just be able to follow the Constitution and still maintain this union. There's no reason for this country to split apart. They already anticipate that's what's going to happen. Well, of course, Abraham Lincoln is the Republican candidate in this election. And here's what the results are going to look like in the 1860 election. Abraham Lincoln sweeps the North. Republican vote is very strong there. Really, up here, the election is really just between Lincoln and Douglas. And Lincoln's going to be winning in almost every case. Only, part of New Jersey will go to Douglas, and Missouri, a border state, will go to Douglas as well. Down here, Lincoln isn't even on the ballot. Down here, it's an election between John Breckinridge and the Constitutional Union Party. And you can see Southern Democrats sweep everything in the deep South. The Constitutional Union Party will just take some of these border states, right between free and slave territory. But notice the numbers here. Okay, there's 4 candidates, and in the past, sometimes when there's 4 candidates, no one will win enough electoral votes to be declared president outright. Remember Andrew Jackson? He had more electoral votes than anyone else, but he didn't have 50%. And so the House of Representatives had a chance to make John Quincy Adams the president. That was 1824. But in this case, even if you added up these other numbers, even if Breckinridge and Douglas and Bell somehow could combine their numbers, it's not going to be enough to overwhelm Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln still had over 50% of the electoral votes. There's just simply more people in New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio. There's more people, more population means more electoral votes. So Lincoln is going to be elected president without any Southern support, without any, he's not even being on the ballot in Southern states. That's enough for some states to leave the Union already. Really, if we start with South Carolina and just make our way. It doesn't happen exactly in this order, but starting with South Carolina, the 7 most southern states will leave the Union after this election. They don't believe there's any future for them in this country under Abraham Lincoln. So South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. 7 states leave the Union immediately or very shortly after this election. Once fighting starts, they'll also be joined by Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia. And we have the Confederate States of America against the United States of America. We will come to that very sad but interesting chapter in American history next time. See you then.